It's a pleasure, Lord de Vesci, to have you speaking to us here today. Tell us first and foremost about your family and how you guys became connected with Abbeyleix.
Well, originally my family were from England, and they came over to Ireland in 15 something or other as Church of Ireland and Protestant clergymen up in the north in Coleraine, and they changed religion about every 2 months in order to try and stay on the winning side. And the most direct ancestor that I can easily claim back directly to was a clergyman up in Coleraine, whose son then went on to be an Archbishop of Tuam. And it was his son, Thomas, who was also a bishop, who became ultimately Bishop of Ossory in Kilkenny, who started the association with Abbeyleix. He married Miss Muschamp, and his father-in-law had land interests in this area, and that was the first connection. And that would have been the early years of the 18th century, so 1720, 1730, around that time.
Originally, Abbeyleix was on marshy land, but it has moved into where it is now. And your family had something to do with that.
That's right. The original settlement of Abbeyleix was because of the Abbey of Abbeyleix, and it was a Cistercian monastic settlement. And the non-monastic buildings and inhabitants all clustered around the Abbey, which was close to the river. But the area where the houses were, and they were very modest houses, you know, really basic and not made of long-lasting materials. They wouldn't have been stone or anything like that. They were all near the Abbey, near the river, and of course the land was very marshy and prone to floods, and there were no drains, and the conditions were pretty grim. So after the Abbey, of course, had gone after the dissolution of the monasteries, my family, who were the big landowners owning all of this area, laid out this new town of Abbeyleix on what was farmland. And there are maps showing this, what is now Abbeyleix, as farmland and just fields with little pencil lines on it, showing this is where the main street is going to be, and these are where the side streets are going to be. And they just built it like a kid would make a Lego project for a rainy afternoon. And that was the origin of Abbeyleix.
And of course, then when this town was formed, I suppose, you started business and generated employment around the area.
That was the next step. I mean, to get the town established and to get commerce and to get it on the map. So to try and get the transport routes to go through it, and originally that was the road, which isn't along the line of the present road to Portlaoise, but the Dublin Road came through it. And much later, the railway line, there was a lot of influence used to make sure that the new Dublin to Waterford railway line went through Abbeyleix, because that was hugely important to commerce and transport, because it meant that your market goods could go freely and quickly up to Dublin, which was made them much more saleable. So the transport was hugely important. And carrying on the back of that, all the other entrepreneurial setups of mills and so forth that my family encouraged. There was a lot of mills powered by water, with incredibly intricate water schemes in order to provide the fall of water at the site of each of the mills, because the land immediately around Abbeyleix is not tremendously hilly. So there was huge engineering works to get water to the mills, and there was a worsted mill, and there was a flour mill, and these were big affairs. And another mill where the Laois foxhunt hounds are kept now. So those were 3 mills, and then the woodlands here were very important, and forestry. My family were always involved in forestry, and that provided a lot of employment. And they set up sawmills, which again provided a lot of employment in the town. And then by the early 20th century, there was a realization that was not really much for girls, ladies in the town. They couldn't obviously work in the sawmill. So my family started a carpet factory in the main street of Abbeyleix, on a site that's occupied by Bramleys now. And that made carpets, hand-woven carpets, and a lot of research went into this to find the suitable designs. And at that time, my family were very involved in the arts and crafts movement and design and so forth. And they were basically Turkish design carpets. following a technique that was bought from the neighbouring landlord in Durrow. It was a particular stitch that had been developed by Lord Ashbrook, and my family acquired the rights for this so they could set up this carpet. And they made wonderful quality carpets. And there are photographs of all the girls and ladies of the town working in the carpet factory, all in beautiful little pinafores and so forth. And they made carpets they were very, very good quality carpets. So they made them for really smart houses, all the big stately homes. And in those days when families came, they went to stay with one another very often. And when a sort of smart family would come and stay with my family in Abbeyleix house, they were, judging by the visitors' book of the carpet factory, it would appear that they were kind of frog marched down to the carpet factory on day 2 and not let out until they bought a carpet. So a lot of these carpets ended up in some of the more famous and grand houses in Ireland and also in England, and the Titanic as well. There were carpets made by the Abbeyleix carpet factory for the White Star ocean liner shipping line, including the Titanic. Thomas Vesci, who was the Bishop of Ossory, he married the daughter of somebody called Denny Muschamp, who had land interests in this area. And he actually leased property in Abbeyleix initially, and then subsequently bought the freehold in a very long, convoluted story, which ended up in legal cases and lawsuits, and there was lawsuits going on for almost 100 years in Dublin. But eventually, by about 1770, it was all established that the Vesci family, because that was my family name, had the freehold rights of this area. And it was only when they had the confidence that the lawsuits were behind them that they built this wonderful Georgian house by the very famous and fashionable architect James Wyatt, which is Abbeyleix house, which was in my family, and it's where I grew up. And we sold it in the 1990s. And so that was when the family really put firm roots down here. Although I think there was an earlier house called Knapton House, which I believe my family lived in before Abbeyleix house was built in 1773-4, around that time. And then after that, my family have always been based here and have always been resident here, and were never absentee landlords at any stage. So they stayed here throughout the famine, and were quite involved in the relief works in the famine, and soup kitchens and employment schemes to help all the tenants through that horrendously appalling time. So they were very, very much here, hands-on, roots down here, and not, you know, going off to London and spending the time there. And we've kind of been here ever since. My family were almost obsessed with education. They were tremendously interested in education, and the realization that through education became a chance for everyone to better themselves, and that was for the good of everybody. And actually only recently I discovered that the first Viscountess de Vesci, which had been like 1770, was showing a visitor at that time around her new school. So it goes way back as far as 1770. And the history, the amount of schools in Abbeyleix, and they would all have belonged to my family or been leased, you know, out by my family. And the second Viscount de Vesci, who was the one who was most responsible probably for laying out the new town, he was particularly interested in education, and there are letters that from his period that he wrote and received from a very famous educational pioneer called Pestalozzi, who was a sort of similar to Montessori. You've probably heard of the Montessori children's schools. Pestalozzi was Swiss, and he had very radical ideas for education, very new ideas for that day, where the children would be treated much more sympathetically and with less discipline, and allowed to discover the pleasure of actually learning themselves. And so John, the second Viscount de Vesci, was very interested in that. And there's a list of, I think there were about 9 schools in Abbeyleix at one stage. Astonishing history of education, and my family being very, very interested in encouraging education and starting new schools. And this building that we're in now was one of those buildings. It was the Patrician Brothers School, and there's another very beautiful building at the other end of the town that was built in 2 stages, one in 1843, which is one date stone at one end of the building, and enlarged in 1893, 50 years later, which may appear later on. You might have a shot of it in this film, I imagine. But they're just examples of all the different school buildings and the efforts that my family made.